He walked into the courtroom in a plain suit, no big-name law firm behind him, no press waiting at the door. To most people in that room, he was just another underprepared lawyer, too quiet, too modest, too forgettable. The opposing counsel barely looked twice. The judge barely glanced up, but what they didn't know was that the man they were underestimating had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. And when the truth finally came out, it didn't just win a case, it exposed a broken system and forced the entire court to stand still. In the world of high-stakes legal battles, appearance often speaks before argument. From the moment the case was announced, it was clear who the courtroom favored. The opposing lawyer was everything the legal system revered: seasoned, charismatic, backed by a prestigious firm, and accompanied by a small team of assistants who handled his files with precision. His voice filled the courtroom with the kind of authority that made people nod before he even finished a sentence. Judges knew him by name, clerks greeted him with familiarity, and reporters already assumed which side would win. He didn't just walk in with confidence, he walked in with an expectation of victory. In contrast, the man on the other side was barely noticed. His suit was neat but simple, more functional than fashionable. He carried his own case files, took notes quietly, and didn't waste time on grand gestures or courtroom theatrics. To many observers, he looked like someone sitting in the wrong chair. Some questioned how he had even taken on a case so complex. Others assumed he'd crumble under pressure. His silence was mistaken for fear, and his modest demeanor for inexperience. In a profession driven by ego and volume, his calmness was seen as weakness. But what they didn't realize was that he had walked into courtrooms like this before, not with attention, but with purpose. He didn't need a reputation to validate him. His preparation ran deeper than most could imagine. While others played to the crowd, he had spent long nights poring over transcripts, laws, precedents, and tiny details others had ignored. He hadn't come to perform. He had come to reveal. His client wasn't a celebrity, a millionaire, or someone with influence. They were an everyday person buried beneath the weight of a system that didn't always favor the truth. That's why he took the case. Not for glory, but because he believed someone had to. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it wasn't to impress. It was to build. Every move he made, every objection he raised, was carefully placed. The court might not have realized it yet, but he was laying the foundation of something far more disruptive than a single case victory. He wasn't there to play the game the way it had always been played. He was there to challenge it, piece by piece, with nothing but focus and unshakable resolve. While they laughed and dismissed him, he quietly prepared to shake the very ground. They stood on. He prepared the case without an audience, without applause, and without a team of associates sorting papers or fetching coffee. There were no conference rooms, no high-rise views, just stacks of files, a worn-out desk, and relentless focus. Every evening, while the world slowed down, he dug deeper into the evidence. He read through reports others had glanced over, revisited depositions line by line, and traced inconsistencies that had gone unnoticed. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fast, but it was deliberate. He wasn't just building a defense. He was reconstructing a truth that had been buried beneath procedural shortcuts and convenient narratives. The case had been dismissed by others as unwinnable, too complicated, too messy, too stacked against the accused. The prosecution had painted a story that fit easily into the public's imagination. A simple explanation, sealed with selective facts, supported by questionable testimonies that no one had bothered to question. That's what frustrated him the most. It wasn't just a legal oversight, it was a moral failure. His client had been labeled guilty long before the courtroom ever opened. The court of public opinion had done its damage, and most lawyers would have avoided the case for that reason alone. But he saw something that others ignored. Not just holes in the story, but the human being trapped inside it. The man he represented had no wealth, no status, no political connections to protect him. He was one of many who'd fallen into the cracks of a system that often moved faster than it thought. For him, this wasn't about career points or billable hours. It was personal. He saw himself in the quiet desperation of the accused. And so, he worked, hour after hour, day after day. He built timelines, gathered overlooked statements, dug up buried documents, and quietly assembled a case that didn't rely on flair, but on undeniable fact. He didn't talk much about what he was doing. He let the silence do the heavy lifting. In that silence, he found clarity. Free from ego, free from pressure, free from distractions. And in that clarity, he uncovered not just one mistake, but a pattern of errors, assumptions, and legal negligence that pointed to something much bigger. The more he uncovered, the more convinced he became. This wasn't just a case of wrongful accusation. It was a test of what the justice system truly stood for. He wasn't just defending a man. He was defending the principle that truth, no matter how buried, still deserved its day in court. The courtroom had followed a predictable rhythm for days. The opposing counsel dominated the floor with loud, confident statements, polished presentations, and a tone that dripped with certainty. The jury had nodded along. The judge had rarely interrupted. It all seemed routine, like a machine already set in motion. The other side spoke as if the outcome had already been decided, and few in the room questioned it. Every argument was met with assurance. Every rebuttal seemed to fall flat. And through it all, the quiet lawyer sat patiently, taking notes, observing every detail, not just in the words being spoken, but in what was being skipped over. He had watched the prosecution construct a timeline built on convenience. He had seen them breeze past contradictions, rely on testimony that shifted slightly every time it was told, and anchor their case on a version of events that didn't quite line up when scrutinized. But he waited, not because he was unsure, but because he knew timing mattered more than volume. He was not there to compete in theatrics. He was there to reveal the truth in a way that couldn't be ignored, no matter how much the system tried to look away. When his turn came, he didn't raise his voice or rush. He opened a folder and introduced a piece of evidence that had been sitting unnoticed in the court files for months. A seemingly unremarkable document. But it contained a timestamp that directly contradicted the core of the prosecution's story. A surveillance log that placed a key witness somewhere else at the exact time they claimed to have seen the incident. It was clean. It was irrefutable. And it was devastating to the case against his client. The room shifted in an instant. The jury's attention, once drifting, locked in. The judge leaned forward. The opposing lawyer's face lost its composure. Pages rustled. A once straightforward narrative suddenly began to unravel. He followed it up with a second blow, a statement from a witness who had previously been dismissed, but whose account, when cross-referenced with the newly introduced evidence, now painted a completely different picture. The foundation cracked, then crumbled. Doubt had not only entered the courtroom, it had taken center stage. In that moment, the entire room saw what they had missed. The man they had underestimated had just flipped the case upside down. He hadn't done it with noise or ego. He had done it with quiet precision. And now, no one could look away. The verdict was just the beginning. When the jury delivered their decision, it wasn't only a moment of relief for the accused, it was a moment of reckoning for the courtroom. Whispers followed as people tried to make sense of what had just happened. What was once viewed as an inevitable conviction had crumbled under the weight of careful evidence and overlooked truths. But beyond the verdict, something deeper had shifted. His arguments had not only dismantled a single case, they had uncovered how easily justice could be misdirected when no one bothers to dig deeper. What he brought to light was more than just an error in judgment. It was a pattern, a flaw in the very structure that claimed to protect fairness. As word spread, so did the questions. Journalists who had ignored the case began investigating the gaps his presentation exposed. Legal analysts revisited the chain of evidence. Commentators who had assumed the outcome now rewrote their takes, focusing not on the defendant's past, but on how the system had nearly erased a life without due process. His strategy was studied in law schools. Young attorneys referenced the case not for its legal complexity, but for what it proved about attention to detail, persistence, and moral responsibility. What had started as a trial became a touch point. For reform conversations, from legal forums to government offices, he had never asked for attention. He had no PR team, no media contacts, and no desire to stand in the spotlight. Yet the spotlight found him. Headlines labeled him as the unknown lawyer who changed the game, the quiet defender who exposed the cracks. Invitations arrived, for interviews, panels, even awards, but he turned down most of them. His focus was still the same: the people who came through his door looking for help, not headlines. He hadn't taken the case for status. He had taken it because it mattered, because someone had been forgotten, and he knew what it felt like to be overlooked. To those close to him, the case wasn't a surprise. It was inevitable. His entire career had been built on the belief that justice should not depend on wealth, status, or reputation. Every late night, every dismissed case he'd taken, every loss he'd learned from, had prepared him for this. And now, the system that once ignored him was being forced to listen. Not because he shouted, but because the truth he uncovered was too loud to ignore. He hadn't just won a trial. He had shifted the conversation. After the case that changed everything, he returned to the same office where it had all started. Nothing about the space had changed. The same second-hand desk, the same creaking chair, the same walls lined with case files marked by time and quiet effort. There were no reporters waiting outside, no film crews looking to capture a victory lap. And he preferred it that way. Fame had never been his pursuit. The truth was all he ever chased, and now that it had spoken, he simply turned back to the work that still waited for him. New files, new names, new stories, people who still felt unseen, still afraid the system might swallow them whole. But this time, they came with a little more hope. Not because they believed the system had changed overnight, but because they knew someone in it who wouldn't look away. Within the legal community, his name no longer floated under the radar. Judges who once overlooked him now paused when he spoke. Colleagues who used to dismiss his quiet approach now studied it. The courtroom began to treat him differently, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it in a way few could replicate. His reputation didn't come from television, appearances, or flashy trials. It came from discipline, from preparation, from proving that even in the face of overwhelming odds, patience and principle could still prevail. He never let the attention change how he operated. He still worked late, still charged fairly, and still met clients eye to eye without pretense. The people who walked through his door didn't see a celebrity lawyer. They saw someone who listened, someone who had already shown what could happen when the truth was given a voice. And, for many of them, that was enough to believe again in justice. Not the kind written in law books, but the kind that lived in the hearts of people brave enough to fight for it. His legacy wasn't built in a single case. It was built in every quiet decision that led there. Every time he refused to rush. Every time he chose fact over assumption. Every time he treated someone with dignity, even when the world had not. That's what stayed with people long after. The headlines faded. He hadn't set out to shake the system. But he had done it, not with power, but with principle. In a field where volume often overshadows substance, he had proven that quiet conviction can echo the loudest. And now, the courtroom would never underestimate him again.